Amen. Well, folks, I have been asked to say a few words, and I'm going to tie it in to a general theme. The people today in the class that I'm teaching, and the people who are watching this, are what has often been called Christian proficients. There is a book that is written by the popular priest in England named Father Martin Thornton. The book is entitled Christian Proficiency. Now, Christian proficiency, according to Father Martin Thornton, refers to the reality of individuals who want more than just Mass on a Sunday morning. Now, for a moment, I want you to think about that. The vast majority of people who go to church, by and large, like perhaps because maybe they've selected it, to be in the church on a Sunday morning. They go home afterwards. Some of them stay for coffee hour or lunch, some don't. And in the most technical sense, they have satisfied that which they were asked to do, namely to keep the Lord's Day and attend Mass. They have done it. But then there are other people, and that's not as large a group of people who say, I need more than that. I want more than that. I heard the lessons at the Mass today, but I want to know more about it. Where did that come from? And there are others who say, I see a bishop, I see a priest, I see a deacon, I see servers, but honestly, I don't really think I'm called to that, so there must not be anything for me. And of course, that's never been true in the course of Christian history. But the dilemma is, we oftentimes can only talk about that which we see. An example would be if I would ask the average Anglican, tell me your favorite deaconess stories. Well, most would say, I've heard there were deaconesses, but I don't even know if I've met one. Well, I can tell you all my favorite deaconesses stories simply because I'm an old man, and so that meant that there were a lot of them around when I was a boy. And deaconesses had a very important role in the church. They were, in many ways, like catechists. But if people don't know there are deaconesses, then how could they ever say, maybe that's something to which I've been called? Now, the same is true with religious orders. When people think about religious orders, if they're really highly sophisticated, they can probably say, I know the difference between monks and friars. But I can assure you, every time I watch a movie, watch a TV show, or go to a play or a musical where somebody is being portrayed in a particular fashion as a monastic, the degree of error in all of those presentations leads me to ask the question, if I know this area and I see how many inconsistencies and inaccuracies there are, what about the parts that I don't know so much about? Are there the same sorts of inconsistencies and misinformation? I have that problem with the news media. Whenever I hear them speak on any number of subjects which I'm not as familiar, I have to accept that they know what they're talking about. When they start talking about religion, in most instances I discover how little they know about religion. So let's take it with religious orders. Sometimes people think of the Benedictines as the primary religious order, and that already would be a problem. Because if we look very carefully at the earliest days of the church, we had men and women who found that the Christian life that they wanted to live was more difficult to live in the context of everyday life and communities, and to some extent even in churches. And so they decided to go out into the wilderness, so to speak, because they know that there were certainly some excellent examples. If you think about John the Baptist is one obvious one. And they did that, and so in what today would be called the Eastern Church, which back in those days would have just been called the Church, you will discover all sorts of information about the Desert Fathers and some Desert Mothers who would go out into the wilderness, into the desert, and they would spend their lives in prayer, contemplation, meditation. Now, the development of religious orders should be obvious to us. That is, as the church grew, perhaps more people asking those questions, and especially as the church grew into the West, it brought up issues of how could that be lived out in daily life. And if you look at Monte Cassino, if you look at a man by the name of Benedict, and I think you know enough Latin to know that couldn't have been his name, because Benedict just comes like from benedictus, blessing. And so if you look at Benedict, you discover that he said there are a number of individuals living all sorts of remarkable lives. Should we have some codification? That is, should we have some things that are done in general and then later specific? And so he came up with eventually what would be called the Rule of St. Benedict. It would be named after him. And in it, he does a magnificent job at noting ora et labora, that is, work and prayer, or prayer and work. And then what we see, though, is that stability, and in many instances staying in one place, was a part of that rule. So that being able to see by the time it develops a number of buildings, you understand what those structures are. The largest of the Benedictine structure would have been called a minster. And then there would have been a place where the abbot lived, and that would be called an abbey. And then as the abbey grew and they wanted to establish more houses, they would send somebody out who would be called the prior. So then we had priories. So minsters and abbeys and priories were all part of that Western development. What happened, though, by the medieval period, we discover that not all of these orders were providing absolutely everything that everyone needed. And so what that led us to was at least one man who was called back after hearing a voice, he himself having been a troubadour, which was essential for a wealthy person. That is, his parents, the Bernardrones, were very wealthy cloth merchants. And because mom had some French background, they nicknamed their son Francis, even though he was John Jr. And so here was Francis, who suddenly heard the voice of what later might be called Lady Poverty, calling him back from his endeavors in what was a troubadour style, but caught up to some extent with the Crusades, came back, and in a matter of moments was seen as being a little bit absurd by his friends and family, because he could have had anything and he sought to have nothing, but sought to have everything in Jesus. Rebuilding the church, being able to hear the words coming from the cross of San Damiano, or the cross from St. Damien, which says, "Francis, rebuild my church, for as you can see, she is falling down." And now many people took that as being literal, as did Francis, and that particular church, San Damiano, needed to be rebuilt, and of course it did. But when the voice kept asking him to do more, and a lot of the construction is being done, the question was, what kind of rebuilding? And eventually it became evident that it was the rebuilding of the church, as we understand her to be the bride of Christ. Now, there were initially those who sought to be able to follow him, and I guess in some ways, since they were men and women and some married, companions were probably in some ways those who just simply wanted to be a part of the rebuilding process. Later, because of questions that would come up, we would have the eventual name of the First Order, and the First Order would be those friars, males, that would be living in community some of the time, but they were called that because it's just simply the word for brothers. And then we have the Second Order, which to a large extent came into existence because of a young woman, of a wealthy young woman, whose name was Chiara, or Claire, who eventually went to the Benedictines to learn how she could become a Franciscan. and learned at least the rudimentary work of living in community and having a rule of life. Eventually, men and women, clergy and laity began to follow, and so we had the third order, which in the Latin just simply comes out as tertiary, third order. So we had first, second, and third orders. Eventually, as history would develop, there would be classifications within those orders, but at that point, in the beginning of the order, reference is made to the first, the second, and the third order. The third order in particular were men and women who felt, as I was saying earlier, that they wanted to have more than just a Sunday morning experience. And so they began to ask the question, how could I be a part of this group? Because many of them could never figure out exactly what happened within a Benedictine order. The Benedictines had a group which were called oblates, which comes from the Latin word for offering, oblation, oblates, oblation, same word in root. And that meant that they were offering or giving their vows, their promises to the abbot, and in a particular fashion according to the rule of St. Benedict. Franciscans would be different because a great deal of the Franciscans' work would be among the people. It was not a matter of having a place as much as it was having a place in the world, in the hearts of people, among people. And so it is that in the church today there still are a number of religious orders, and there are a number of them that are encouraging of men and women, clergy and lay, to become a part of whatever they call their order. Oblates, tertiaries, associates in some places, companions. There are a number of terms that have been used throughout the course of history with all of these various religious orders. Many of them, actually most of them, are pre-medieval or around medieval. Later on, you will discover in the Roman Catholic Church, at least, that one order sprouted that was to be sort of the right arm of the Pope, and that was called the Society of Jesus. Today it's named after the founder, Saint Ignatius Loyola. And so it is, we are met today with a number of exciting opportunities for people to serve the Lord. Just because you don't see it, just because you haven't read about it, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. In fact, probably the healthiest way to approach a religious life and religious order is, if I think of it, I should not think highly of myself because I'm the one that dreamed it up. My job is, now that I understand that call, to discover what God has already put forth and exists so that I may enter in and find out how it is that I can be a part of it. I, for example, have been a Franciscan tertiary since the year 1967, meaning that I've lived a Franciscan rule of life all of those years. There are many others who have done the same. And so I invite you, all of you, if you feel that God is calling you to something more than Sunday morning, first of all, find out what that means in the context of your parish. Generally speaking, when you're called to more, it's within the context of the parish. Sadly, we live in an age today where people oftentimes think that means they have to run off someplace else to get it. But generally speaking, if the need exists, God will raise it up in the parish. And if the need exists and it's raised up in the parish, God will show people ways in which they can live that rule. People who want more than just Sunday morning are not superior to other people. They simply just have a unique call upon their life. In order for them to be obedient, they have to respond to that call. May God bless you as you look carefully to see what God is calling you to do and to be.